Terrorism is much in the news, and talking about the face of terror are Adrian Levy, whose latest book was about the hunt for Osama bin Laden, journalist S. Hussain Zaidi, a veteran of investigative crime and terror reporting, and Mukund Padmanabhan, editor, The Hindu. I welcome them onto the stage.
Good afternoon. Wonderful to be here at this session with two accomplished authors, both of them written books on extremism, terrorism, but both very different books, even though they're united in some respects. Adrian's book is, of course, about the hunt for Osama bin Laden, which is a big, fat book with many details. Hussain's book profiles eight terrorists/extremists, and it's a sort of profile of each of them. Each of them constitutes a chapter in the book. Although they're very different books, I think they're sort of bound by at least one similarity in approach, is that they try to do it from the inside. This is not some official version of what has happened or an official version of what someone is or what he represents. Both of them make an attempt to try and understand the mind of the people involved in this. So that would be my first question, since that is, I think, the sort of single most striking, unifying thread in your works, Exile and Dangerous Minds. How important is it to understanding this phenomenon of terrorism, getting in from the inside? You want to take it?
Hey, lovely to be here again, and thank you for inviting me to Chennai, to this festival. We've never written about phenomena. We've never written about terror per se. Like our interest right from the beginning has been on people and trying to understand people and what they do and what their motivation is and what their extraordinary stories are. And my belief is that unless you can find that psychological reality, that domestic reality, unless you can get to that engine that drives families, then you can't understand who people really are, and you can't begin to understand the evolution of their actions. And quite often the way that newspapers write or governments propagate information, they denude great events of their humanity. And what we see is inhumanity. What we see is inexplicable. What we see is depressing quite often, and frankly frightening. The act of terror, is to disable us. So my response to terror has been to humanize it by finding the humanity in the people who contrive acts, who conspire. And nearly always what you find in those situations is extraordinary home truths. I mean, I could name any three quickly before Hussain talks, but the fact that Osama bin Laden married his fourth wife because he had a midlife crisis. And that midlife crisis led him into a relationship with a 17-year-old girl from Yemen. And that then pitched his family into crisis. That led to the head of security quitting the organization, exposing Osama. And then, in fact, that led to a political fissure in the... So his sex drive and his perception of himself at that point in time threatened Al-Qaeda more than the drone warfare. There are maybe four other facts that I could think of that come to mind where the personality in individuals and the knowledge of the beating domestic heart of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's caravan tell us more about Al-Qaeda than press releases or State Department facts or information generated by intelligence agencies.
Yep.
You want to add to...
No, I just wanted to add about writing from the inside, yeah.
See, about this book, Dangerous Minds, which I've co-authored with an IG rank police officer, Mr. Bijay Singh, who's the head of cyber cell of Maharashtra Police. We wanted to unravel and understand the terrorist minds. I mean, earlier I've done books on organized crimes and the top criminals like Dawood Ibrahim, Chota Shakil, Abu Salim. We have never delved into the minds of the terrorists. So both of us thought that we should try to explore these very warped and convoluted mindset. How do we understand them? Should we go to some psychoanalyst? Should we try to go for the police files and try to understand them? So the only way to understand a man is to go to the backstory of his life, see the motivations and the drive that compelled him to do what he did in his life. So we chose some characters. There's an MBBS doctor who comes from a very poor background, but he devoted his life to killing people through 80 bombs in a span of 4 years, then healing people. There is a medical student who wanted to fulfill his ambition of being the Simi chief in Madhya Pradesh. So he went on a spree of bank robberies, 6 of them in a year and a half. And one of them was in Manappuram Gold, where he walked away with 3 kgs of gold to finance his terror activities. And he wanted to be the Khalifa of Madhya Pradesh. Medical student, barely 21 years old. Then there's a housewife in Mumbai slums, whose husband, who returned from Gulf and wanted to take revenge for the Gujarat riots, but he was very unsure that whether he should do this or not. And one fine day, his wife asked him, Fahmida Sayyed, that, why are you so quiet? What's eating you? And she thought maybe he's having midlife crisis and he's involved with some other woman. But then he revealed that he wants to take revenge and he wants to do this. And Fahmida says, I'll help you. Fahmida became a bigger terrorist than this man, as the judge said, that this woman was not just an accomplice, but she was the kingpin of the whole terrorist acts of the Gateway blast and the Zaidi Bazaar blast in Mumbai. So these are the things that we have done in the Dangerous Minds.
It's great to hear that, Mukund, because I think one of the things, one of the reasons that Hussain and I have found each other, in a sense, is that we're really interested in primary sources.
Right.
And we're in an age, Mohammed was talking to me before here, about how you find facts and who you trust, and the hierarchy of information and how you research. I think if you're reliant on the perspective of governments, you're starting off on the wrong footing. It's interesting to feed in what governments think and feel. We can get to bigger picture later. But unless we understand the people themselves and we go to primary sources who are the people or people near the people, then what we're writing is always through a lens of distortion.
Yeah, on the issue of sources and this decision, just a quick question on, which I wasn't planning to ask, but since you raised this, a quick question on just how you got into writing Exile. This is Osama's 4th wife's family reaching out to you, and this leads into a treasure trove of information.
Yeah.
So just tell us a little bit about that briefly.
Okay, there's sort of three paths. One was luck. And a lack of self-censorship. I've talked about this before. Like a lot of people spend too much time telling themselves what not to do. Don't go there, don't do this, don't ask this question. So we abandoned that policy in about 1999, and instead we just plan to go everywhere, and then we work out how we'll survive when we're there. So the first thing is no self-censorship. The second thing is looking for, I heard Peter Frankopan talking about a historian's view, where you look for fissures in history which become important to give facts. We look for people and events who are peripheral, and then we build a pyramid. We start from the widest possible base, and we build in and in until we reach the point where we can approach towards the pinnacle. So in this sense, we were in Pakistan. We knew shortly after the raid on Abbottabad, and we knew that the children of Osama bin Laden were being held by the ISI. And we had a rough idea where it was in Islamabad, in F6. And it's impossible to keep a secret in Pakistan. And we found the house really quickly. And the house was really poorly guarded. And it was possible then to exchange notes, find a way to get in. We got photographs out of the children. And then we exchanged information with the family, published a story in the Sunday Times in London showing the children were being held as hostages, effectively, by ISI. And that led to one element of a relationship. And then a lot of people, as you discover, and I'm not sure Hussain, I know from a conversation we had the other day, a lot of people are on WhatsApp, they're on Telegram, and they're addicted to social media. And so their day jobs may be apocalyptic, but at night time, they're on social media, and they're updating their Facebook account. And it's amazing what you can do on WhatsApp and Facebook. You can reach pretty much anyone in the world in the way that intelligence agencies and cops can't.
Yeah, one of the things about writing from the inside, I imagine, is winning the trust of, or the confidence of the people you write about. And so what is in it from them? I mean, do they assume that they're going to get a sympathetic portrayal? Or is it just, the fact that their stories are never going to be told in official versions, and so that gives them a real urge to speak. You want to take that
I don't
first?
think they look for sympathetic portrayal. They think that this man is going to write the truth which the cops are trying to hide and trying to smudge. So they try to confide in you. Now, knowing very well that we won't get bought or influenced by the agencies or by the seniors, we won't get intimidated. And this trust is not built in a day or in a single meeting. It takes several meetings where they test us in so many ways. And then when they realize that we have not violated their confidence, their trust, then they start sharing deeper and more bizarre details, which they know that this guy will not compromise and will go and write only the truth and reality. And that's how we do it. So my whole point here is that they don't trust police, they don't trust the enforcing agencies, but they trust the journalist who they feel is independent and free from any kind of influence from these agencies.
Yeah, it's a really good answer. I think also most people have never been approached because of the position of self-censorship, and increasingly fear enters the equation, particularly when you're living in an epoch of terror and barbarism. People fear so much that they stop asking questions or even trying to ask them. So I think actually dismissing that element of fear straight away and actually asking the question gets really surprising answers, because people then say, you're the first person to try and come. You're the first person to actually say to me X, Y, and Z. And so that it comes back to a self-censorship issue. You know, if you don't ask, you don't find out. And in fact, another issue really, I think you probably agree, is ego. You know, like jihad is a business, spying is a business.
The economics of jihad. We'll come to that.
Yeah.
No,
and so, but these guys are egos. You know, they're egos. They compete with it. They compete with each other. There's competition
and
within
they
it.
don't see us as threat to them.
Yeah, we're minnows.
Yes.
You know. Can I just say one thing, just
Sure.
to interrupt you, Mukund? One thing. And we were talking about this before coming on today, that really this is counterintuitive what's going on this panel, because really, in reality, anyone who knows Hussain or knows me knows that what we mostly do is listen. And it's like a career of listening. Really, Kathy, who I work with, who's more than 60% of what I do, Kathy Scott-Clark, what we are is professional listeners. And in those listening positions, you spend hours sitting in someone's room in Thane, and what you do is listen, and it's a joy to listen. And speaking is actually the opposite of what we do. You know, we've got small social media profiles for that reason.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, both books have, particularly yours, I think, have stories about perfectly average, normal people suddenly getting up. I mean, there's the doctor, Ansari, there's the housewife that you mentioned who, you know, just her life changes radically. I think the cases like yours, people, you know, settled, seeming to live a sort of what by some definitions would be an average life, and then turning to terror. This project of trying to understand the mind of the terrorist, yes, I get an insight of the kind after having read your books, which I wouldn't have had without reading them. But do we really have a theory? I mean, there's so many competing theories of what causes terrorism. I mean, the theories that poverty and ignorance is breeding around, but we know that many of the leading, you know, the leaders of jihadi groups are not exactly, you know, they're rich, they're educated. So, I mean, even if there's not a single explanation, do we have anything that even resembles?
Yeah. I mean, we're moving into tricky areas here, because, like, first of all, there's there's a second question that dovetails with that, and that question is, can we describe the terrorism? Right, before we can work on a theory, what we have to do is we have to work out if we can describe it. And the reason I say that is that most terror, or most events that take place, whether they be 26/11, 9/11, 7/7, the multiple bombings that struck India after 26/11 and before, individual acts of terror, can we describe them accurately? Right, the first challenge is to describe them in a way that states don't describe them, and by getting into the epicenter of those events to make them revelatory. Just very quickly, before dovetailing that to your question as to the why people then do it, if we can describe the event accurately, then we may be able to come to the motivations of the individuals. So, for example, if you read the first gloss of history on 9/11, you know, what you would believe is totally different to actually how it was conceived, you know, and yet states that are victims have narratives too. So, for example, you know, 9/11 happened and then America marched to war with Iraq. And it pointed at Iraq and it said Iraq had WMD, Iraq sheltered Al-Qaeda, it was a state sponsor of terror, and therefore our next campaign of hard power will be to go to Iraq. And the real situation was that Pakistan and Iran sheltered Al-Qaeda, they had WMD, AQ Khan sold it all around the world, and the two natural targets after 9/11 were Iran and Pakistan. Pakistan made no deal with any country. Iran offered Al-Qaeda to America, and Dick Cheney, as the vice president of the US, refused the deal in order not to disrupt the narrative of the war with Iraq. And so a needless war was fought in which millions of lives have been lost, civilian and military, because the wrong narrative won out and the wrong story was told. So when you ask me what are the causes of terror, we have to look at jihad as a business and war as a business, and the historical priorities of countries that fight those struggles, and then we can ask about the mindset of Osama bin Laden and his wives, and we can talk about Dawood Ibrahim, who's sublimated into another thing. So my firm belief is, one, describe the facts on the ground accurately first, and then let's move on.
I would say about this people joining the terror groups. You know, there are two kinds of people. One is a leader, and I mean, it will be very unbelievable to say, but they have a proper, full-fledged HR department where they go scouting for the youths who have some grudge and some grouse against the system. It could be because they have lost some dear ones in the riots, or they think that the government is unfair. So such youths are then roped in, they are brainwashed, and they become the lieutenants for these top guys, top warmongers. And then they are told, in the name of religion perhaps, it's jihad, you will get 70,000 huris, you will get a palace in heaven, or you're doing this for the sake of your brethren. This guys gets influenced, and then they want to do anything. Why the book was called Dangerous Mind is simple, that these guys are doing illegal acts of killing people, causing carnage, bloodshed, violence, but they are made to believe that what they're doing is an act of worship, and which is why these guys are dangerous. And which is why that tomorrow, suppose if we start believing that stealing is allowed, killing someone is an act of virtue, what will happen to the society? So these people are actually taught anarchy, and these youths then go and serve their masters who are actually doing the bidding of their own masters. So they get a lot of money from their sponsors who give them thousands and thousands of dollars. Like 2611 was orchestrated, the whole recce business by David Headley, for mere $20,000 given to him by the ISI. $20,000 was just the funds needed for the recce of 2611, where 10 boys came later on, caused so much of bloodshed.
So the kind of drift I'm getting from here is that there are two kinds of people. Those at the top, who are probably educated, rich, powerful, manipulative, ideological, you know, and you have people at the bottom who are possibly dysfunctional, poor, perhaps. Would that be
it's a huge sliding scale.
Sort of,
yeah, there are different
do you think
flavors.
there is a scale? Yeah.
At the moment, I think we're lumping together by necessity and a lack of time, like many different kinds of flavors. So, and there are jihad armies which are wielded by nation states. Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the ones you know so well in South Asia, are basically an extension of state power. And then nowadays, there are different cells of jihad, and the cells of jihad are financed from Saudi Arabia and from Qatar, and they're in India, and they're in Britain, and they're in Germany, etc. And those cells are awakened, and there's a different kind of terror that's sublimated from that. But basically, there's a pecking order, and right at the top, there's the full range of people, from egos, psychopaths, politicians, and people who fundamentally also believe that there's an injustice. So, for example, the corruption in Saudi Arabia, the guardians of the most holy sites, the House of Saud, corruption and brutality, the crisis in Palestine, the inability to solve any of the deadlock in the Middle East. There are plenty of reasons that can be used and manipulated, and yet we can discuss those, but behind the scenes you have a character like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He didn't believe in any of those events. He was an intriguing, clever psychopath who liked blowing things up. And so, you know, what you have is a psychopath who then meets with a cause, wields that cause, and recruits people. But Kathy said an interesting thing to you, Hussain, at a meeting we had in Mumbai. Her point, having worked with the Federal Investigation Authority for a year to make a film in Pakistan, is that even people who are dysfunctional village boys who are set on martyrdom missions, nearly all of them choose not to complete the missions. And so what the manipulators of terror started to do was to put a second switch on a suicide vest. So a child, a girl or a boy whose family is fractured and who's been gradually attenuated and whittled away and sent on a suicide mission believes that they will push the button that will lead to the attack on the convoy. And increasingly it's remotely controlled by someone else who knows that they won't go through with the mission. So there are levels of manipulation that go on here. Levels of bloodshed, levels of control, and they're all very different.
Yeah, I'm just going to take off from something you said. The story of how political terrorism, if that is the word for a targeted, specific kind of terror motivated by political demands, has sort of morphed, and this is an old story, into a sort of broad millenarian kind of terrorism where random acts of violence, there's great collateral damage, soft targets there's targets have got softer and softer. In this connection, you mentioned the Jaish and the Lashkar. I mean, the Jaish is, Pakistan headquartered, sorry, but has Kashmir at the top of its agenda. The Lashkar has, well, Pakistan located probably again, but has a larger footprint and has conducted different kinds of act in different parts of the world. Can we make granular distinctions between the way different groups operate? Are we all getting into a kind of religious millenarian kind of terrorism? Are there still differences between, say, the Jaish and Lashkar?
Well, there are differences because, it was found through the interrogation of Ajmal Kasab in Bombay that you said that there were certain Ahl Hadith. First of all, there are a lot of sectarian conflicts in the radical side of Muslims, where there is certain Deobandi, there is something called Ahl Hadith, and there is Salafis. So he said that he's from Lashkar, and Jaish, he says that they are from Ahl Hadith. So these are Salafis. So first of all, they have a lot of sectarian differences, and they justify themselves that because they are on the right side, what they are doing is correct, and what the other is doing wrong or unfair or totally illegal. So those are one, but regardless of these sectarian differences or the ideological conflicts that they have, my whole point is that...
By sectarian, you mean...
The ideological thing, Ahl Hadith,
okay,
Deobandi, Salafis, those issues.
So Deobandi and
Yeah, yeah. So all these guys have ideological mindset. They all believe in a bit of variation in the Islam and the Orthodox belief, and they point finger that the other person is wrong, which is why Jaish and Lashkar, they keep fighting. But the whole point that I'm trying to make is that regardless of these differences, these 17 terrorist groups, according to a report, was found to be the under umbrella of Markaz. All of them were operating under one umbrella, one big umbrella, and they all were doing the bidding of their masters, killing people and causing so much of disturbance and anarchy in this country. So it doesn't matter whether they have differences or conflicts. What they're doing is actually the business of jihad.
Yeah, I think things changed fundamentally after the Red Mosque. If everyone remembers Lal Masjid, I think up until Lal Masjid, there were groups that fought very much as singular entities, and they came together when they had particular skills to lend an operation. So, for example, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi...
Yeah, the parliament attack was attributed to both.
The parliament attack. And Lashkar-e-Jhangvi were a really good example. They really used to love just killing Shias. They were just a brutal, bloodthirsty sectarian, a lot of cannibals and pirates. And then they decided that, in fact, what they were really good at was logistics. They became the leg men in bank robberies. And what they could do was they could apply logistics, couriers, transport to any operation. So when Lashkar-e-Toiba needed transport, they'd go to Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. And then Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for example, learned another skill, which is they learned that if you took the colour stabilizer from the garment industry, you could sublimate it in a way to make a key ingredient of a kind of explosive that was used for 3 years until they changed the chemical formula in Pakistan. And so they then became essential as a cook, and they were used as cooks by other outfits. And so very, very specific skills were set up. After Lal Masjid, and the Pakistanis were seen on live cable TV raiding a mosque to sort that situation out, a lot of groups came together. And what you had then was LET dividing and moving towards Al-Qaeda, and you had Lashkar Jangvi moving towards Al-Qaeda, and you had Dawood Ibrahim moving towards Al-Qaeda, and suddenly you had, for the first time, the coalescing of different flavors of terror, motivated by Lal Masjid and other external factors coming together, and it became much more deadly, much more deadly. And 26/11 saw a large number of groups plotting and planning before the Mumbai raid, which included broad flavors of people who normally hated each other, including Masood Azhar.
But 26/11 also opened up the rift between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in a way, didn't it, for a while? I mean, there were suspicions.
I think that was just a bit of propaganda that was put out. I think they were all really privately delighted with what they did. And I'm not sure that is true.
And if Lashkar Jangvi is killing so many Shias in Pakistan, why do they have an office in Tehran? Tehran is why is supporting them. I mean, Taliban is after Pakistan, the only other country where Taliban has that kind of freedom, it's Tehran. They have an office, the bank, they have a very full-fledged operating bank accounts and their operatives, and they have given them amnesty. So that's what I'm saying, that the whole issue of the sectarian conflicts totally gets diluted when we see that they're divided by the common aim.
Yeah, it's not, Iran is like a really important factor, which we can get to, but also America too. So, for example, in the Bonn conference, if we just have a tiny bit of history really quickly, in November 2001, after 9/11, the big conference is called, and the conference is to decide how Afghanistan will be reconstructed. And so America met with Hamid Karzai, and they met with the Iranians. The Iranians helped them broker a deal to shoo in Hamid Karzai as their puppet president to rule Afghanistan. And at the same time as the Iranians did that, the day after that meeting in the Bonn conference, the military attaché and the CIA flew to Italy and funded the MEK. And the MEK, the armed resistance to overthrow the Iranian government. Now, those two actions could happen simultaneously because nation-states manipulate terror. That's what they do. So it's not just the narrative of the East, it's the narrative of the West, and we have to see them multiply. There's a lot of manipulation.
Exactly my point. Use them whenever they are useful to you, and drop them when they are useless.
So you've had, say, Al-Qaeda, which is what your book principally deals with. I mean, you've had the hunt for Osama. I mean, he was killed. That was preceded by others being found out, caught, and so on. But is the Al-Qaeda possibly stronger today than it was?
Yeah, much stronger.
Why?
Yeah. It's
and
incredible.
How?
So many reasons, it's absolutely extraordinary what they did. When they saw what was going wrong with the organization around 2003, when the bloodshed began in Iraq, the barbarism and the brutality began under Zarqawi in Iraq. They formed something called a lessons learned faculty, which they borrowed from the US Marines. And the job of that was to look at everything going wrong and work out how to make it go right. So they began writing a series of reports. They began in 2004 and they ran until 2008. And in these reports, they detail all the things that went wrong, how they'd alienated the Muslim wider community, how they'd alienated fundraisers, how barbarism wasn't working to win over people, how they needed to build a base as experts, and how they needed to win the women's vote back into the wider community because they'd alienated women with the attacks on children, etc. So that lessons learned faculty led to an organization transforming into a different kind of beast. It became then a committee of experts, and it was looking for a way to lend its expertise to military struggles that were taking place around the world, particularly in Syria and Iraq as those fronts opened. And their letter writing on that is extraordinary. There's a real fierce debate within the organization. They thought of rebranding. They were going to drop the name Al-Qaeda. They looked at Hezbollah. They looked at different models, including the Quds Force, and they said, how can we create a Dawa wing so we will be in charity and will also be a committee of experts to be working with the military. And so to think that these are people sitting in a cave who are not responding to world events is only a misdirection by Hollywood. They're people who are sophisticated, who move much faster and are much more plastic in that sense than governments. You know, they are in the long term. They are looking at the long-term view. And you could argue that Al-Qaeda manipulated Iran just as much as Iran manipulated Al-Qaeda. When they did 9/11, there may only be 400 full-time members who'd sworn an oath to Osama, and now they can call upon 40,000 foot soldiers in Syria.
What was in it exactly for Iran? I mean, Shia country, harboring Sunni terrorists?
Non-sectarian So,
there was a larger
pragmatic
religious
picture. They're not operating in 5-year presidential cycles, which actually means 3 years of administration, 2 years of electioneering. They're operating in a clerical cycle, which begins at 10 years and is calling upon 1,000 years of history. And when they operate in that clerical cycle, they're looking at bargaining pieces, and they're non-sectarian. Quds Force, their only belief was that the enemies of our enemy are our friends. And so they began in December 2001 inviting wholesale Al-Qaeda into the country, and they gave them shelter in northern Tehran. And now the military leadership of Al-Qaeda is in Tehran, in District 9, and they're beyond the reach of anybody.
No, I mean, as I said, there's a common enemy. Hezbollah is a Shia organization, and Hamas is a Salafi organization. But both of them are united and funded by Iran, because they both are fighting for Iran against Israel. So the whole thing is that it's the agenda that rules that who should be supported. Though they might be having issues with them over the sectarian ideological issues, but then when they fight, they have to look at the common enemy, the main target.
Yeah. It's impossible to draw too many conclusions from it either, because I think we were bantering before about history in the back of a Hilux. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing history in the back of a Hilux. History that every day that Toyota Hilux veers to the left and veers to the right, there's a new idea. So when you sit and spend time with clerics now, if you're in Jordan, or you go to Mauritania, or you go to Syria, the stories that you hear this week are different from the stories that you're going to hear next week.
So if there was a question about the economics of jihad, which is something that you drew attention to, and if we were to name 2 countries where most of the funding came from, would Saudi Arabia and Pakistan be your 2, or would it be elsewhere?
It's a known fact that in India, whatever terror activities have happened were only because of 2 reasons. The funds came from Pakistan and training. Funds came from Saudi Arabia and training from Pakistan. I mean, there's
the funds came from Saudi Arabia,
training from Pakistan. Some 700 crore rupees have been annually transferred to India in the guise of educational development, building mosque or madrasas, but actually that money is funneled into terrorist activities for the purpose of jihad and for the purpose of causing terror. And if these guys need training in making bombs and arms and other things, these boys are taken to Pakistan, where in those forests of Islamabad, these guys are taught to make bombs, RDX, and then they are sent back to India. That's what. So those 2 countries, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, are united against India. And whereas, as I said, that this much money is coming for a different excuse, or a reason like making madrasas or mosques, but are used for a different purpose.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. I think Qatar is one of the most important bases right now. The Qataris, there's pretty much a direct pipeline right now from Qatar that runs through Iran and then out the other side to Iraq and Pakistan. And the capital flows are not massive, because terror costs nothing nowadays. It costs very little to cause a lot of harm. And actually, it's the ideas that are more problematic. It's the cult of death. The cult of death is very difficult to address. And it's very attractive in desperate times where society is deeply fractured, particularly in Europe. Let's look at terror, there. In a Europe that is fractured by popularism and by racism, that cult of death has taken hold massively. It's taken hold in Germany, it's taken hold in Britain and France and Belgium. And you've seen the incidents that have happened. People have tried to theorize around it, initially talking about lone wolf attacks. In fact, none of them were lone wolf. They're part of wider networks that are activated slowly using digital means. But the basis for it is a pervasive cult of death that has taken hold. And the finance for that is minute. It's extremely slim. It's actually an idea.
Sometimes they are very selective, and their actions are very inexplicable. For example, these ISIS say that we are against the enemies of Islam, and they will go 2,000 kilometers to attack in Paris and Brazil, but they will not try to look at the traditional enemies and thinking of attacking someone just 50 kilometers away from them. For example, they consider Hamas or Palestinians to be having issues with Islam, a lot of issues. They won't even fight against Israel, but they'll go to Europe to fight. Who does this? Why are these things so convoluted and difficult to explain and understand? As I said, that it's only the cult of death. They only want to cause death without making us understand what exactly the real reasons or compulsions are.
Yeah, just a question on how the state, in this case the US, dealt with with the people it's suspected of being involved in 9/11 and connected to Al-Qaeda. There are horrific stories of torture in your book. I mean, they are like, there's the extent to which they went to get stories out. And there's also possibly a stupidity because it didn't lead, as you suggest in your book, to actually information coming out. And I just wonder, whether this kind of reaction just, stories get out and
that phrase,
they just make things worse. And I wonder whether, in your experience, you've collaborated with the police officer in writing this book.
Yeah.
But how do we deal with suspects? And
blind fury.
What kind of impact does it have on actually, just
Mumbai police would like to project and claim that they never get involved in third-degree tortures. And
is that true, Hussain?
I mean, they claim. What do you think?
No, I think that they are capable of doing fourth-degree torture, which I wrote in Black Friday, exactly. There's a chapter where, under TADA, the accused have to confess voluntarily, and that becomes a part of incontrovertible evidence against them in the court. He can't retract, he can't go against the judgment, the statement, and that is his death knell, that's his death warrant. How do you extract this kind of voluntary confession out of a man? Beating will not, torture will not. So what they start doing, Mumbai police start getting the relatives and wives and sisters and daughters of the accused inside the police station and threatening them with rape or some kind of dishonor, which kind of compelled the man to sign on the statement. This is what is called fourth-degree torture, because no beating, no subjugation, no humiliation, but the threat of a woman losing the chastity and honor, which is what forced the men to sign the
I think the power of vengeance has been very destructive, self-destructive for America. There's a massive internal debate about how they reached the position. A lot of Americans say, how did we get here? And in fact, the story of how they reached Abu Ghraib and how they reached the black sites and rendition and Guantanamo is one that people are piecing together slowly, and it begins with a whole series of defeats after the victory of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan brilliantly stitched together Europe after fascism and was a high point of moral leadership, and then a series of defeats that took place. It's a very long story to tell, but a very brief snapshot and an interesting one is that during the Korean War, a huge number of pilots were captured by China. And using very simple but brutal means, the Chinese got them all to say absurd things on TV that undermined America and the morale of the American fighting force. And the CIA and scientists working for covert organizations looked at that period of the demoralization of American forces and created an organization that would address how to bolster the defenses of fighting people when they're captured, so that they talked less and they broke longer. And that line you can draw from that period in the 1950s to Abu Ghraib now, because those policies were reverse engineered when America sought vengeance via the Vietnam, that were reverse engineered against detainees in the war on terror. And then you had black sites, then you had waterboarding, then you had sensory deprivation, etc., etc., etc. And the diaries written by the people in those black sites make for horrific reading.
They do. Well, I mean, recently America announced that it would withdraw aid to Pakistan. This was linked to ostensibly to the Haqqani network. Can you throw some light on that? Why is Pakistan been engaged with the Haqqani network for so long? I mean, this has been going on now for almost ever.
Yeah, I think there are so many mistakes in the way that this is described. Just to give my tiny insight into this from talking to people recently. First of all, Pakistan was never an ally to America. It's expressing its own national interest, and its national interest is to rule via the protection of...
Support one warlord in Afghanistan?
To support many different conflicts which can give it strategic depth, whether that's in Afghanistan and also on the Indian border and with Iran, and to foster its port in Gwadar, etc., etc., etc. Many different things. So when Americans talk, like if you read Richard Haas on Twitter right now, Richard's position on Twitter and this, talking State Department of old is, there was such a loyal ally to us with the Mujahideen in the 1980s, and then we had to cut them off because of the nuclear bomb, so we've been through this before. In fact, that's a total rewriting of history. They were not an ally in the 1980s. They took America's money to fund their own Mujahideen. They then applied that money to create their own Mujahideen against India and other countries using the American model. And the reason America cut them off in 1990 was the Presler Amendment, but America had facilitated the Pakistan bomb for the 10 years before as part of a reward for fighting in Afghanistan. And so the question now is, what are the behind-the-scenes pulls and pushes that make America decide to do it again? And the conversations that are taking place right now in Washington and Islamabad and in other third-party countries like Vienna and Geneva where they're meeting are to do with putting Pakistani troops inside Yemen. So America wants to get out of Yemen. They want special forces and American munitions out of the bloodbath in Yemen. And all other nations that are European powers don't want to fight there either. It's Saudi's brutal war that no one's writing about. And so what they want to do is create a Muslim force that will go in there, that will claim victory. And that Muslim Sunni force, they want to be led in a peacekeeping way by Pakistan. And so one division has moved over already from Rawalpindi over to Saudi Arabia. And the hope is they can put enough pressure on Pakistan so it'll fight their bloody war for them in Yemen. And the blowback for them will again make a fragile, unstable state.
Okay. Isn't it America which is trying to make all the Muslim countries fight against each other for its own personal gains?
Yeah.
So how come Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are then American allies? I mean,
they're not
being obedient slaves to their masters. And Qatar, which was until recently Saudi Arabia's ally, is now the enemy number one. Yeah. All because Saudi wanted to isolate Qatar. And why is America following Saudi Arabia when they know, and it's a known fact, that Saudi is a terror country?
Yeah, but Saudi's one of Saudi's newest and friendliest allies at the moment is Israel. They've lent each other land space. 2 islands have been given over. They're sharing satellite footprints. So unlikely allies are forged in these new conflicts. At one point you had Hezbollah, CIA, ranged against ISIS. Who would have thought it? The regular balance of power is being reconsidered. That's what I mean by history in the back of a Hilux. Every month there's a different power.
Actually, America is shielding 2 of the world's biggest terrorist states like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan.
We can't just let that go. Come on, we can't let that go. Because there's a human cost to all of this. And while it's true that they have used terror and they have wielded it, they did it under Zia to start with, to suppress Shia landlords. They created these sectarian murderous fronts like Sipa al-Sahaba and Lashkar-e-Jangvi were actually to suppress the power of the Shia landowners in Pakistan in 79. But actually, there's also a huge cost within Pakistan. And the more time you spend there, the hundreds of thousands of people who have lost their lives, their property, their livelihoods, we have to reflect that too. The cost internally in the country has been extraordinary. The bloodshed in Peshawar, the bloodshed in Fatah, I mean, really tremendous.
Okay, we apparently have 15 minutes to go, and there are invariably more questions than we've had time. So I'm going to just ask one last question and then turn this over. Soft one. Both your works are collaborative works. I mean, and yours was with an IPS police official. How did you divvy up the work? I mean, did you leave a lot of the sourcing to him, or did you just split it up, the book into half? And you too. I mean, do you bring separate strengths into this, or and if so, what they are? Just curious. I mean. Either of you, yeah.
Well, see, it is very difficult to write a book with a police officer, that too such a senior rank IG who has seen so much of terror and has written so many books. His earlier book was a fiction, Quantum Siege, about the nuclear threat to India. So if we both would have decided to collaborate on each profiles, we would have had a lot of differences and conflicts and fights and arguments, which he thought is not a nice way to do a book. So we both divided the number of profiles, and we said that I will do these 5 and he will do those 3. And that was easier. So that way, we don't have to stand up for our opinions and our beliefs about each terrorist. We don't have to justify and rationalize that what we are talking about and why we have written such a passage in this manner. And that was the safest way, that without a fight and argument with a cop, a senior cop, we could have a story out safely in a year's time.
Okay.
Yeah, I've worked for 24 years with the same person. Sometimes it's maddening. So we drive each other crazy, and sometimes it's massively rewarding because there's someone to pull you out of the wormhole. There's someone to objectify the stuff that you're doing. If you've spent a long time pursuing one source and it turns out to be irrelevant, you're going to fight to keep it in a book, even if it's irrelevant, and someone else will not know the journey you've been on and just cut it cruelly. And the only thing that is a negative side is if you carry over any bitterness in your everyday life into your professional life, in which case then you begin to kill each other's characters maliciously for no good reason whatsoever other than someone's pissed you off on that day. But actually the collaborative exercise, and we don't just collaborate together, we collaborate also now with filmmakers, games makers. We're trying to find different platforms to tell stories and find other people to collaborate with us who will let information leach out to the widest possible audiences. And we've been talking quite a lot in the festival about how to reach people. It's wonderful that such great audiences have come to this festival, but actually a huge number of people now don't read. They're very hard to reach. We only have to look at the election of Trump and the base that got him elected, and at populism in India and the cost of that populism and some of the spin that's come off that. And in Britain, the Brexit vote, and then the news that the next day after the Brexit vote, the highest Google search item was "What is Brexit?" To know that communicating with our base and identifying what it is more important than writing in itself. So we may have things to say, we may have knowledge and skills, but it's irrelevant if A, they're not true, and B, because truth is a big issue we've not touched on, and B, they don't reach people. So reaching people now as a newspaper, as a writer, as a filmmaker, that's what matters. How?
Okay, wonderful. Questions, anyone?
Hello, sir. My name is Satish. I would like to ask Mr. Hussain, sir, do you think it is right for Ajmal Kasab to be hanged when his bosses are still running free?
I'll just narrate the story how he was arrested, and then you can decide whether it is right to hang him or not. When he was picked up in South Mumbai, the whole Mumbai police was fighting against an unknown number of terrorists. They were not even sure how many people are there out there killing them. So they knew that so many cops have died and so many were trapped and all those things were known to them. But when about 5 of them, was trying to kill this man, Ajmal Kasab, only one cop came forward and said, "Don't kill him. This is our evidence against Pakistan. If he is killed, Pakistan can always say that these are not our guys, and then we will have nothing to prove that these were Pakistani terrorists." So these 5 cops were stopped there. Now we had a full-fledged trial. We proved that he's a Pakistani. Someone even went to his house in Pakistan and found out that he's a Pakistani citizen. After the trial, only he was hanged. We know that there's a capital punishment. We even hang Indians for rapes, murders, and such crimes. So why not a terrorist who is responsible for killing so many people?
My name is Aditi Mukherjee, and I've read both your work. My question is to both of you. Either of you can answer that question for me. See, Adrian earlier spoke about the lack of self-censorship that we should employ if we want to write better. As a writer, I think a lot of, the reason why there's a lack of self-censorship is because we are afraid. In your experience, how are you not afraid? I mean, you guys go into very difficult territories. How do you do that?
Being really well organized. I think, like the fear question, it's a bit like the war. There's a lot of war horsery that goes around people who talk about, when they get involved in reporting in conflicts and stuff like that. Actually, it's nothing to do with any of those things. It's all about organization. It's actually targeting how you work. Begin with the pyramid, build up a base, move tighter and tighter and tighter into the subject till you find the right person who's relevant, and then go for that person, and nowadays there are so many ways to do it before meeting. You've got to have 10 plans, of the 10 plans, 4 may get near to working, of those 3 might actually bring you nearer, then you decide, well, you've got 5 cell phones, 1 driver, a meeting place, and invariably the phone network goes down and all of those plans have gone too. You've just got to always be resourceful and keep moving forward, and the fear element that people talk about makes good movies. But actually, it's meticulous planning, it's like ruthless, meticulous planning, much more than any of the other aspects. That's what I meant by self-censorship. If you say, I might be scared, then you won't do it. And actually, the boring side, it's how do you survive the boredom? How do you survive the mundanity of organising yourself every day? That's harder.
Okay, well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm a New York-based journalist with roots in India. I've done some investigative work as a journalist. I'm an author, and my crime thriller, Victims for Sale, is going to release the day after tomorrow by HarperCollins. My question for Hussain is, Hussain, as an investigative journalist, the experiences you draw upon from that line of work, how would you say that has influenced your books, like Mafia Queens of Mumbai, for example, in terms of, so that's one part of the question. The other part is, how do you draw the line between reality and fiction in terms of, striking a balance between keeping your narrative extraordinarily real, while at the same time infusing it with figments of your own imagination? Thank you.
How much creative license, in other words? I think you answered that, yeah.
Would say that I only take about 2% of liberties while writing it, a non-fiction book. I use a bit of imagination. For example, I'll tell you how I use my imagination while writing this non-fiction. If two Muslims will meet each other, I will presume that they will not say, oh, how are you doing? How man? Have you had your dinner? How was the drink? Champagne? I will presume that they will say salam to each other. That is one imagination or liberty that I'll take. So I'll start my dialogue with a salam. And then the usual pleasantries that two Muslims will exchange. Now if Haji Mastan had called Jinabai on a, say, night of August, which in Mumbai is a monsoon season, I will presume that it must be raining heavily, it must be a dark monsoon night when Jinabai visited Haji Mastan. And since it was a black Mercedes, I will add some element of mystery that the Mercedes belonged to Haji Mastan, where he summoned Jinabai from that house. So, as I said, just a bare 2% of imagination that is used, artistic license, when I'm narrating my stories, just to make it more interesting.
Hello. Sir,
and whatever facts are contradicted by, I always try to speak to multiple sources. So if two of them have said something which is true or in the same line, if third one contradicts, then I would rather drop that story. So you will see that in my stories there are so many passages, unconfirmed reports, or there's an apocryphal story clearly saying that I'm not sure of the fact, but I'm just mentioning because I heard it from some source here.
With the big push being given to electric vehicles in all the developed countries, the oil prices are definite to drop to $15 to $20 or even less in the coming decades. Will it change the face of terror? Because the funding in Saudi Arabia is not going to be there, and if they are not able to take care of their own economy, there will be more internal conflicts, and the kingdoms should crumble down. And then the face of terror will definitely change or soften.
It's more an economics question. Do you want to take that?
I think, if you look at the Mohammed bin Salman plan for Saudi Arabia, he's published it. It's called 2030 Vision, his vision plan, which was written by PR consultants in Boston. That plan describes the size of their reserve, and they're planning by 2030 to have moved into alternative energies and to build new cities in the desert. But the size of their reserve in Aramco, in the state oil company, by just selling off 2% of that, they can make so many trillions of dollars that if you put together the ratio, or you reflected on the cost per act of terror versus the size of their reserves, it'll have no effect whatsoever. The real effect is whether or not he can create trickle-down in his economy to empower the alienated working and middle classes who despise him and his family, and keep the House of Saud in power. If the House of Saud is fractured, turns against itself, eats itself up, then we'll see a whole different world.
Hello,
Sir,
I have a question.
My question is on the same lines. Like, you were saying that war is a business. Sir. You were saying that war is a business. As far as like India is concerned, like if there's a violence incited into India, whose business will be going good? Is it Israel? Is it America or Pakistan? Like if it's been a violence incited into India.
Sorry, can you repeat that once more? With the mic close to you, yeah.
Like if it's been a violence incited into India, like if terrorism been incited into India, whose business will be going good? Is it Israel, is it America or Pakistan? Because you are saying war is a business, so
who's gaining from the business of terrorism? Is it America? Is it Pakistan? Or is it
In India, whatever violence happens or whatever terrorist activities happen, it only benefits our neighboring country. So their business will be like totally in profit because they have managed to cause more instability and more disturbance in this country. They believe in the philosophy of 1,000 cuts or prick and bleed. They know very well that they cannot conquer India otherwise, but they have to take revenge by causing instability and violence here. This is their business. Those terrorists are small outfits or splinter groups. You can call them franchisee of Pakistan who are causing so much of troubles here in this country. So it's the business of all these people.
Yeah, I don't agree.
Hello, sir.
I don't agree with that. I think that there's a level above, which is corporations. I think corporations are super governments, and that they communicate with each other in ways that governments can't. If you look at the way that they aggregate and they form economic power, look at Davos. Look what's going to happen during Davos. Follow it really closely and see who's there. This is not conspiratorial thinking. This is just a statement of fact. The capital bound up in those meetings in Davos and the power that's extended and the politicians that they own and control and can influence will explain a lot of things. You know, why is it that Murdoch gets to sit in to so many meetings, you know, whether that's in the Oval Office or number 10 Downing Street? Why is it that those buildings don't want to give up their visiting lists? Because it's embarrassing how many oligarchs and industrialists come calling with suggestions over government policy. It's obvious that corporations influence, corporations win. You know, the people who win manufacture weapons, of course, but beyond that, power feeds corporations. And, you know, India is a victim of that through geography and also in relation to being encircled by China, which is another force we've not mentioned.
Faiz.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Faizur Rahman. You mentioned about the human aspects of terrorism, but I think you didn't elaborate on that. In fact, I entirely agree with what you just said. We need to take into account the economics of it also, because I read Peter Taylor's book, Talking to Terrorists. I'm sure you would have read it. And also John Perkins, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. If you add both these books together, and then you get a perspective of what real terrorism is all about. I think most of it is a reaction to all this onslaught of economic, takeover of the other smaller countries. So what is your answer to that? Can you elaborate on that a bit? Thank you. No, I'm asking you. Thank you.
Agreed. It's well put. It wasn't really a question. You brilliantly summarised my thesis. Totally agree with you.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Zaidi. Journalist Gauri Lankesh had mentioned in one of her columns that crime journalists in India recently are at an increased risk of becoming part of the underworld that they write or cover. Talking with particular reference to Mr. Ravi Belagare, who was arrested recently. Then there's Agni Sridhar from the Kannada tabloid industry, and also Suhaib Ilyasi, who is the host of India's Most Wanted. So we know them really well because of all their stories about the underworld, and they're all, a crime suspect now, criminals now. So what is your view on that?
Gauri Lankesh was not killed because of her writings against the underworld. I mean, we all know that the reason behind her killing was more of a political thing than the underworld. As far as Suhaib Ilyasi is concerned, it was more of an act of passion. It was, again, not an underworld involvement in the act of crime that he committed. So the only place where you can say that recently a journalist was killed by the underworld was Jyotirmoy Day of Mumbai, who was a crime journalist and who was killed in 2011. Again, it is not yet clear that what was the reason for his killing. And the underworld was actually misused in that killing by some people. The trial is still on, so it's not right to comment on that murder.
Crime journalists becoming crime suspects, that was my question.
Oh, so that only Suhaib Ilyas is the guy who has not become a crime suspect, but as I said, it's an act of passion. So you can't generalize that so many journalists have become crime. Agni Sridhar was a part of underworld, Kannada underworld, who became a journalist later. So how has he become a suspect? He was earlier a criminal and later became a reformed journalist.
Right, I think, just one last quick question, I believe time is up.
For the first time in my life, I heard you mention the 4th degree torture inflicted on the people of Mumbai city. I thought there was only 3rd degree, and so first time you have mentioned fourth degree where they bring the wife and the kids along. So do the top IPS officers approve of these kind of internal
So
violence?
it's part of the amnesty report following Mumbai riots in 1992-93 and serial blast, where these were made part of that report about the 4th degree torture, where they have documented these cases, and not just one, but several such reports were done, and Tisa Zelwaz has documented and filed so many things together. So I might have mentioned it today, but it's there on the public record since 1995.
Okay, I think we have to end. Time's up. So thank you very much. Please give them a round of applause.